To be human is to recognize the humanity in other people and treat those people with love and respect.
Hey, what's up, y'all? This is Michael Franti here, and welcome to this week's edition of the Stay Human podcast. As always, presented by the mighty Gibson Guitars. I'm super excited to have this week's guest on board. He's already amassed over 40 million on-demand streams to date, and he currently has just dropped an absolutely massive single called Throw It Back, which features country music superstar Keith Urban, matching his sheer boldness and dynamic flow with Urban's effortless charisma and string-bending guitar prowess. Throw It Back makes for a true country anthem. He's currently on select dates supporting Dierks Bentley on his Beers on Me tour, in addition to playing his first headline shows and festivals. Please welcome to the show, BRELAND. What's up, BRELAND?
What's up, man? It's a great introduction. Good to be here.
Man, I'm stoked to have you. And I'll tell you why, because throughout my life in music, I've never fit in. You know, I've always been like the misfit toy. Like I'm the toy that's like, got one button for an eye, and I'm wearing the wrong clothes at the wrong time, I'm mixing genres of music. And forever people have always been like, what do you do? Like, what is your style? What is your music? And I'm just like, I'm just me, you know, I'm just who I am. And I take whatever flavors that just roll in. And that's what I love about what you do. And it's fascinating to me because that's the way that music has always evolved, you know, and always changed. And yet when it happens, there's always some resistance to it. So I want to know, well, first of all, just describe how you would say to people what it is that you do.
I would describe it either as no genre, you know, because there's no real boundaries on what I'm doing. It can present itself a million different ways. Or I might describe it as cross country. And to me, cross country is just any song that has a narrative structure, any song that moves somewhat linearly, that has a central story or theme. And it can sound a little bit like country, but also a little bit like anything else. So a lot of the music that I do is kind of at that intersection of country and R&B, country and hip hop, country and gospel, country and pop. So I would call it cross country.
That's awesome that you've been able to pinpoint it that directly. And yet that name is so broad, you know, there could be just any kind of thing. I think of it in the same way of like, when Santana put out his Supernatural album, and it was like, you know, it's clearly Santana playing his guitars, but he's bumping heads with, you know, with Wyclef and Everlast and with Rob Thomas and so many different things. And they're putting it all together, and yet it still has a sound. And that's what I love about your music. And I'm curious, where did you grow up, and was music always a part of your life as a kid?
I grew up in Burlington, New Jersey, which is kind of a small kind of farm town about 40 minutes outside of Philadelphia in South Jersey. Nobody really ever knows it. I usually say I'm from South Jersey, just outside of Philly is the easiest way to do it. But my parents sang still, and they met in a gospel choir at Howard. And so when it came to music, we always had just incredible music playing in the house, vocals, harmonies. They were putting together some musical projects when I was a kid, so I got to watch them write and record. And it was kind of more in the hobby stage for them. They never really broke out in terms of being able to tour or really make a living off of the music. But it was cool to watch them pursue it as a passion, you know, on the side. And I guess that exposure to particularly gospel music, which is really all I listened to as a kid, has informed a lot of the music that I make now.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I do. I've got 3. I've got an older sister named Gigi, and then I've got 2 younger god siblings that I consider to be siblings of mine as well. We grew up together, and they're Caleb and Michaela. So the 4 of us kind of all came up under the same understanding that music was ever present, and it was just a fit in where you get in where you fit in situation.
Do you remember the first time that you really felt music? Was there like a moment where like, oh wow, I'm like, this is something, like I'm digging this? And you know, was there a point in your life when you can recall the earliest time when you felt that?
Yeah, I was singing a song by a gospel artist named Smokey Norfolk called I Need You Now. And I was singing it at one of my parents' friends' birthday parties, and I was maybe about 13. And something just came over me where I just like connected with the lyrics in a way that I just started to sob. Just like literally just was overcome with it. Just started crying. And then the people who were there started crying. And it was a really powerful moment. And I guess it's the first time that I ever truly lost myself a performance. And it's happened to me a few times since, but it was just such an overwhelming sense of one, I am connecting to the lyrics in this song, but two, this I'm drawn to this moment, and that combination of being connected to the art and then the art kind of informing how you're experiencing the moment. It was really hard to put my finger on, but it was definitely an experience that I won't forget.
Did that change you in some way?
It's funny that you asked me that question in particular because I hadn't really thought about that moment until just now in some years. And I think it did because when I ended up going to high school, like maybe 2 months later, it was like the summer after my eighth grade year, I went into high school just believing that I was an artist. And I went to a different high school than the school that I had been in up until that point. And it was a boarding school. So it was just the high school and everyone lived on campus, kind of like college. And when I went away to that school in ninth grade, I felt like I had a chance to reinvent myself and kind of be whoever I wanted. And I had been somewhat of a shy kid, or at least quiet and observant, I guess is maybe a better description, up until high school, mostly because my mom was a teacher at my elementary school. Everyone kind of knew me as Mrs. BRELAND's son. I had an older sister who did all the plays and musicals. So I was kind of in their shadow. It wasn't really until ninth grade that felt like, okay, you know what? I'm an artist. Music is something that I'm serious about. And I could definitely link it to that moment that I had where I kind of lost myself in the performance.
And when you made that transition to that new school, what was the hardest part of that? What was the biggest challenge for you? You know, you arrive at a new school and you're like as you described, like I'm an artist now and I want to show this. Like, how were the challenges for you when you got there?
The biggest challenge was that though I was claiming to be an artist, I didn't really have any songs. So
you didn't have any art.
so like, okay, well, let me hear something. And I realized that I needed to write some songs. So I kind of wrote what I called songs as a kid, but all of the songs I wrote when I was a kid were really just jingles. They would be like 5 seconds long, 10 seconds long, something you might put at the end of a commercial. They never had any real structure or like, this is the chorus, this is the verse, this is the bridge, anything like that. And so I realized, okay, well, if I want to do this for real, I need to, one, have songs, and two, I need a platform. So I started writing songs and doing remixes of songs that were popular and posting both of those things to YouTube, kind of right around 14, 15 years old. And this was early YouTube. I'm 26 now. So this was 2009, 2010 era, kind of right after Justin Bieber had popped off. And I got a chance to watch that whole thing from the beginning. And I was like, you know what? He's not much older than me. And his story isn't all that different from mine in terms of like, theoretically, he's a regular kid who loves to make music. I'm a kid that loves to make music. So I felt like maybe YouTube would be my chance to kind of pop off. It never got to that Bieber state. And in hindsight, I'm pretty grateful that it didn't, because I had a lot of growing to do as a songwriter, as a performer, as some, just believing in myself and honing in on those skills.
So as you're in school, did you go to a performing arts high school?
It's not a performing arts high school. I would say, if anything, it's just like a college prep kind of boarding school. If you want to go to like an Ivy League school or something like that, people would be going there.
So, when you go to a school like that, there's high expectations from people, and as a musician, it's not always like fostered, when people say you want to be an artist, like there's some teachers, or maybe you have parents or somebody who believes in you, but there's always a lot of eye rolling from people. Did you get that kind of like, oh yeah, he's going to be famous someday? Yeah. Right. Did you get that?
I definitely was one of the only students on campus that was performing original music throughout high school. So there was maybe an understanding from some people that like, if it were going to happen for anyone, it would probably happen to him. But also people were kind of like, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily going to happen to him either. So it's funny because the drummer from Vampire Weekend had gone to my high school maybe 8 years before I did. And he came back and spoke and signed a bunch of people's yearbooks one year. And so it kind of let me know, I'm like, okay, you can come out of this environment and make it in music. It's just a matter of taking the road less traveled because it's not a performing arts high school. It's not a school that really has a long history or record of forming superstars, right? Like there's schools in New Jersey that do that. Like Whitney Houston is from New Jersey. The Jonas Brothers are from Jersey. Bruce Springsteen is from Jersey. There are a lot of artists that hail from New Jersey, and those schools and areas in town definitely have this kind of feeling of anything could happen. I don't know if the part of New Jersey that I came from had that, but I personally always felt like, hey, you know, if you put in the work towards something and you have the talent and you treat people with kindness and respect, anything is possible. You know, I kind of just focused more on that than on what the percentages or the odds might have suggested.
So when did things start to click for you? Did you have some point in high school where you were doing performances at the school or outside of the school, or just people started seeing your stuff on YouTube?
It was really a slow build, I guess. Like I did have some performances at high school, and I did have a couple videos that got maybe 500,000 views. I had one video that got like 1,000,000 views. I was crafty about it, right? Like one thing that I did, I would try to put covers up of songs the same day that the song would drop. And so if I could be the first cover and kind of make it seem like it was like the lyric video for the song or something, people would click on it and then maybe stay if they liked what I was doing. So I would get creative on the marketing side, but nothing really ever popped to a point where I was like, okay, I don't need to go to college now. I'm good here with the music. It never really got to that point. It was still kind of just an idea. And it never really clicked for me until I would say really like 2017, which was after I see I graduated college, and I really kind of recognized that I was going to need to grind out on the music for real if I wanted to get to the next level. Because in high school and in college, there are other things that I was involved in on campus. Just being a student, I had, you know, jobs on campus. I was in an a cappella group. I was writing for the newspaper. I was an RA in college. There's just other things that I was doing music as well, but I definitely wasn't locked into it enough where I could be like, okay, I've put in 10,000 hours. I didn't really get to that point until after college and in those first 2 years out of school, where I was like, okay, if I want to make a career out of this, I need to be able to focus on it full time.
At what point did all the different like genres, I guess, I hate that word, but the styles of music that you started to absorb, where did they come from? Were they in your house growing up, or was it like when you got to college, or was it, at what point did you start to embrace these other styles?
It was interesting because my parents are both ordained ministers, and they were pretty strict about not playing any secular music in the house. So it was very much like a, you know, gospel and contemporary Christian music household, with a few exceptions, right? Like there was some Michael Jackson, some Stevie Wonder, some Earth, Wind and Fire stuff that they grew up on that was still cool, but they were really wary of music that was becoming popular in the 90s and 2000s, just from a messaging perspective. And so when I went away to school, there was so much music that was popular that I didn't know about because I had kind of been in a bit of a box, and people would just throw songs at me and be like, yo, you haven't heard this? Oh my gosh, how have you not heard this? So I was kind of just getting put on to a lot of classic rock, a lot of like, you know, early era, like emo pop, like what, just everything that was happening in the early 2000s and in the 2000s that I wasn't really exposed to. People, my peers and classmates and people I was making music with were putting me onto. And so I guess the genrelessness that I have now if anything, kind of comes from that era of musical discovery, musical exploration. I had never really had the freedom or even really the desire to just dive in to understand the history of some of these other genres and styles of music that I hadn't been exposed to. And I'm like, wow, there's an incredible amount of music out there that exists in the general consciousness of the American public that I don't know. I need to first educate myself on this before I can start trying to make it. And so I guess throughout high school, I was just listening to stuff and trying to see how certain things were related. I'm like, okay, well, how does this relate to this? Like, how could someone possibly like these two things at once? Because they're so different. And then, trying my hand at creating it. And I don't think I made a good song until I was a good 1,000 songs in, honestly. Like all the songs that I was making in high school and college, I wouldn't even play them for people now other than just for maybe motivational purposes, because I just didn't have the formula down in terms of structure or lyric or concept or even melody. And it wasn't until I got out of college that it kind of started to click for me. And at that point I was like, okay, I have a good enough understanding of a bunch of different styles of music that if I were ever asked to write something in those spaces, I think I would now have the skills to be able to do so.
At what point did country music become part of it, or a big part of it, actually?
There were some country artists that I liked in high school and in college. I really liked Rascal Flatts just because I felt like Gary LeVox, the lead singer, I felt like he was bringing a lot of soulfulness and kind of has some gospel roots. And so it felt familiar to me. One of our really good family friends was on American Idol. And so we made it to the top 10. So we watched a lot of American Idol. And I think it was the season that Carrie Underwood won. So I ended up following her career for a little while after that as a kid. And then we sang a couple of country songs in my a cappella group, Zach Brown Band's Colder Weather and the Chicks, Not Ready to Make Nice. And I started to realize that country music wasn't just this foreign thing that I wasn't supposed to be a part of. Because I think growing up, there was kind of an understanding where I was from that Black people didn't listen to country music. And that's just not the case. Black people do listen to country music, but country music is often not created by Black people, is often marketed to white people. And there are a lot of factors to why it might never reach a Black consumer. And a lot of that's systemic and intentional. But when I started to just listen to some of these songs, especially some of the newer era country music, Kane Brown was starting to get popular while I was in Atlanta, and he was from the Atlanta area. And there were some people I was working with who were working with him. So I started to see, I was like, okay, people are breaking down some of these barriers. And also there are people within country music that want people like me to listen. They just haven't found a way to break that barrier. So I started getting into it kind of around 21, 22, a lot later than some of the other genres, just because I couldn't point to as many people that looked like me who were listening to it or creating it. But living in Atlanta, especially, which is where I moved after college, and just kind of hearing more country music and realizing that the storytelling and the songwriting within country music was on a different level than a lot of the other music that I was listening to. I was like, you know what, as a songwriter, I really need to dive into this and figure out what it is that they're doing and how these concepts are so strong. And, I just started to become fascinated with the creation of it, and never really thought that it was something that I was going to end up doing as an artist necessarily. But as a songwriter, I don't want to have any boundaries. And I'm like, well, what happens if I end up in a session with a country artist and they want this type of a song? I need to know how to make it. And so I started listening to it, kind of just growing an appreciation for how it was written and what these songs stood for and what it meant to the people that listen to it, the loyalty that country music fans have for the artists that they appreciate. I was like, this is a really cool phenomenon. I would love to be able to participate in it in some way.
You touched on it before of storytelling and linear storytelling. And, when I grew up listening to rap and hip hop, that was a big part of it. You know, we had artists like Slick Rick that would tell like these long, elaborate stories, just go and go and go. And you'd just be like hanging on every word and the way that it rhymed, the way that it flowed, the way there was humor involved in it, the way there was like irony in the rhyming. And hip hop still has that to a certain degree, but a lot of it is just about the cleverness of rhymes and not necessarily like that linear style of storytelling. I want to know about the song Cross Country. Is that like a literal story from your life? I mean, I hear a lot of your story in there, but how literal is it, you know?
The story is entirely literal. That is my experience. You know, obviously a version of it, right? The 2 minute, 45-second version, whatever. But yeah, I knew by the time I made that song, I knew I wanted to have, I knew the phrase cross country was important to me because it was the only identifier that I could give people who were trying to understand what type of music I made. Because everyone always asks the question, what type of music do you make? And I'm like, initially I'd be like, well, it's kind of a little bit country mixed with whatever. And then I came up with the term cross country. I'm like, oh, it's a cross between country and all the other genres. And I was like, okay, cool. This is important. I want to be able to identify cross country songs that exist in the ether that we didn't have a name for yet. Like, to me, Rihanna's Love on the Brain or Higher or even Stay could all be considered cross country songs based on the way that they're written, right? But don't recognize them as such because we don't think about Rihanna as a country artist. But cross country it's just about the way a song is written and the way a song feels and it's interpretive. So I started getting really into identifying cross country songs that I had heard before and didn't know exactly how to classify them. And then I started thinking about my own music and figuring out what different intersections I could play with. You know, I'd done the hip hop and country thing, the country and R&B. And I was like, okay, well, there's some other intersections here that I would love to play with from like a country and gospel perspective, from like a, you know, country and blues perspective, from a country and rock perspective. And I just started getting creative with that. And I knew that I was at some point going to have a tour called the Cross Country Tour. I knew I was going to have the Cross Country album. And I thought, okay, I would like to have a cross country song, but rather than trying to play around with whatever the intersection is, I just want to be able to tell my story on this thing in a way that people can just hear about it straight up. Because some of my favorite country songs and cross country songs alike are really personal narrative accounts. And so I didn't really have any songs that did that. And I was like, you know what, I should do that on the cross country song. So it is a literal account of my story coming from New Jersey, going to college and trying to figure out exactly where I fit in. And then moving to Atlanta and struggling through the starving artist phase of my life and moving to LA, signing the deal, and then ultimately finding a musical home in a place that a lot of people wouldn't have expected.
I know that you've just really started to get your feet wet as a stage performer. How does it differ for you, or do you enjoy it? Or do you enjoy like the songwriting and production process, or do you like collaborating with other people? But how does the being on stage actually feel for you?
Being on stage for me, it's become my main motivator. Now that I've had a chance to do it, I didn't know how much I was going to enjoy being on stage because pretty much after college ended and most of those performances were with an a cappella group, I wasn't really focused on the artist grind at all. I wasn't doing any live performances for a few years or in any capacity as an artist for a while because I was trying to just lock in on the songwriting. And I had some people who kind of naively or selfishly perhaps told me that I would be better off as a songwriter than as an artist. And I listened to them for a while and was in this place where I was just trying to pitch songs because
don't listen to them anymore.
Kind of gatekeepers and mentors of mine that felt more strongly that I was just a songwriter. And so it was really during years that I was like in the studio, really comfortable vocal producing and writing and engineering for people and getting into production a little bit. and doing arranging backgrounds and harmonies for songs and doing basically everything other than perform the song itself. I got really good at all of those things because I thought that that was what my career was going to look like in its entirety, until I made my truck and realized, hey, this is a song that has some sauce and some flavor that I don't really even think I could pitch, you know? It's too niche. I was like, I want to do this myself. And I put it out as a debut single. But then the pandemic hit. So the song caught fire on TikTok and ended up going platinum. I didn't have any opportunities to perform it in front of people. And so I'm like, okay, well, people are looking at me now as an artist because I have music out, I have an EP out, but I haven't been able to perform any of these songs, nor was I performing any of the years leading up to this song. So once performances really came into the picture in May of 2021, and really over the course of the summer, I had no idea how much I was going to enjoy it or not, because I had just had so many dedicated years of exclusively studio work and felt very comfortable there. But I say all that to say performing has become my favorite thing to do. There's no matching the energy that you get when you actually pour all of yourself into a song or a whole set, and the audience responds to it the way that you would want them to respond to it. You know, when you're like, you just leave it all out there. And I'm a pretty energetic performer. I jump around a lot. I try to give my best vocal. There's a lot of energy that I pour into the performance aspect of what I'm doing. And whenever I get that response from an audience, sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it's just like the jaw drop, like, wow, that's crazy. Or sometimes they'll be dancing with me, or sometimes they'll put their lighter in the air, whatever. But when you get that energy back from a group of people, it's just unmatched. You know, I realized that I'm an extrovert from a certain perspective because I've always wanted to entertain. You know, whenever I was in college and even afterward, I would throw parties and have people come over and mingle. And it was such an important part of my week because I had this desire to entertain people and tell jokes and play music and dance and provide a good experience for people. And now that I'm performing, I'm realizing that I get to scratch that itch, you know, all the time. And it always feels really good to be able to provide an experience that people can leave remembering fondly, and they can kind of get their blood pumping and kind of provide some of those emotions, whether it's happy or sad or anything in between, hopeful, whatever. I get to provide an experience that makes people feel something. And that's something that's always been really important to me as a person. I just now have found a career path that allows me to express it professionally.
All of us as artists have this drive to write and express, and we also create careers around our self-expression, and we have obligations to the crews of people that work with us to do what we do and get our shows on the road. And there's like the job part of it, you know, the career part of it. And then there's also like the mission. And you are somebody who's doing something that's very new. And as a Black artist entering into this terrain, it's not just about being Black and going into country music. To me, it's about being who you are, being your authentic self, and being able to let that shine, you know? And it could be the same thing for any other kid who wants to do anything that's different from whatever people's expectations are of them, but they feel like inside this is it. What part of you feels that sense of like mission, you know, like I'm doing this because I want to help or provide a view for other people coming up?
When I first put my truck out, you know, candidly, I didn't really know what to expect because it was the first song that I'd really put out as an adult and as BRELAND. And I didn't really know a whole lot about the current state and dynamics of country music and how it was being created and who was listening to it and why. And I didn't know all of the history at the time that I put that song out. It was just something that felt good to put out into the world. But I quickly became aware of this history and some of the contributions that Black people had made to the genre, and then some of the ways that the genre had shifted over the years and who had been successful within the genre. And, I just became aware of a lot of this history and started having people message me on both sides, people who would message me and be like, hey, I'm really inspired by you doing this because XYZ, and people on the opposite side of it who were like, hey, I hate that you're doing this. You're ruining this thing that I like, XYZ, hate type message. But what I realized is that on both sides, people were responding to me doing something differently. And when I started to realize where that fit into the larger landscape, I was like, oh. And what cross country then became for me as I came up with it and as I started putting more music out as a subgenre of music is I have the opportunity here to be a cultural bridge between two cultures that have been segmented historically by systems that want to keep people apart. And when we bring people together in any capacity, whether it's through religion or sports or music or whatever, when those people come together, it's really powerful because they realize, oh, we're not really all that different. We have things in common. We have things that we can both appreciate. And then from there, conversations can happen. And when you find ways to break down some of those barriers, it's always a positive. And so I guess the mission for me is realizing that my music reaches a really broad audience because I can reach both a country audience and a non-country audience. And, that's been my main motivator over the past year and a half is, especially as performances are happening now, is seeing diverse crowds of people from different backgrounds with different belief systems, different walks of life coming together in whatever space I'm able to perform in, and seeing people make friends with people that are different from them. That is my biggest motivator, is just being able to serve as a cultural bridge with the music.
That's awesome, man. I'm glad that you feel that, just that you feel it happening, because what you're doing is really touching people and it's really making a difference. So I'm happy that you're feeling that, the energy coming back to you. I got two final questions. The first is, what do your parents think of you doing non-gospel music? I mean, when you drop a hit, like, throw it back, and the first line is, I don't know, if she got a glass of whiskey, she'd throw it back. What do your folks think of that?
It's funny, man, and I haven't really told a lot of people this, but truth be told, I was kind of down and out a couple years ago, just trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. And, I was in that space of like thinking of myself strictly as a songwriter and kind of limiting some of my opportunities that way. And I went to visit this church in Atlanta, and it was my first time visiting this church. And the pastor called me out, and I hadn't been to church in a while. And the pastor called me out and started to prophesy. And I'm typically like a very like, hey man, like I just kind of want to like experience this privately. I don't need everyone to, I don't know. I'm just skeptical about a lot of stuff. And he called me out and he was like, hey, you have a gift. You have a musical gift, and you've been in the dark for a while. God is going to elevate you into a position that's going to baffle your enemies. And he's going to do it because your testimony is going to bring people to him. And I was like, what? You know what I mean? It's just, I told my parents about it. I'm like, what do I make? How do I make sense of this? And they were like, well, it sounds like things are about to change for you. And a few short months later, things really started to change for me. And so I think regardless of what the music sounds like, they and me have an understanding that what I'm doing is bigger than me. And what I'm doing is trying to bring a light to the world. And I think that's something that would make God happy. Bringing people together, I think is something that God would be pleased about. And I think he's facilitating a lot of this on my behalf for that reason. So even though it's not necessarily Christian music or gospel music, I think that I'm doing God's work in the sense that I am breaking down barriers that could not possibly be of God.
Bringing people together is a good thing. And my final question for you, BRELAND, is the question I ask everybody on the show. What does it mean to you to be human, and how do you stay human?
I think to be human is to recognize the humanity in other people and treat those people with love and respect at all times. And so I bring that to my work on a daily basis. I don't care that I might be playing a show in front of hundreds or thousands or eventually maybe more than that people at a time. It doesn't make me any better than anyone that I might see on an airplane or a bus or a train or just in the world. We are all having human experiences, and we should all help each other get through those human experiences more easily. And so I think just being able to exist in the world with that understanding is what it means to be human and what it means to be a good human. Good humans help other humans experience life together.
Hey, man, it's awesome to meet you. And I'm excited to hear the cross country album when it all comes together and see the tour. And I'm just really just proud of you, man. You know, like you're doing something that hasn't been done before. You're doing it with a very positive attitude and a really deep sense of mission, which is important. But you're also out there just letting people have fun and enjoy music and love life. And that's a great way to approach it all. So thanks for being here. How can folks find you? Are you active on all the social media channels? I know YouTube is one.
Yeah, I'm active on everything, man. It's at BRELAND everywhere. You can find all the music just under BRELAND and on all the socials. Thank you so much for opening up your platform and for what you're doing, man. I think what you do on this podcast is important and is honestly the other side or on the same side of the same coin that I'm working on and bringing people together and telling stories, man. It's important.
So everybody, if you haven't had a chance, go right now and follow BRELAND on Instagram, Spotify, YouTube, and just do a deep dive. Just turn on his Spotify channel. He's also got a show on iTunes, radio show, the Cross Country channel there. And you can hear of songs that you might not think of as country, but do have that storytelling element to them. And so on behalf of Gibson Guitars, we want to say thank you, BRELAND, for being here today. And thanks for enjoying this week's episode of the Stay Human Podcast. Peace.